Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into one of the most heartbreaking and explosive chapters of this story. What would you choose if your own mother forced you to abandon the woman you love in exchange for your entire future? After discovering that the board meeting was secretly held without him, the CEO realizes that everything has been carefully arranged by his own mother. She gives him a cruel ultimatum: keep the company and leave Tieu Lac, or choose Tieu Lac and lose everything his father spent a lifetime building. But is this really the end? Or is the CEO finally ready to uncover the truth behind his mother's shocking conspiracy? Stay with us until the very end to find out. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas filled with suspense, betrayal, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next episode. The CEO had barely left the hospital when his phone began ringing non-stop. One call after another. His assistant, the legal department, senior executives, even several board members he hadn't heard from in weeks. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He answered the first call. "Sir." His assistant's voice sounded unusually nervous. "You need to come to the company immediately." The CEO frowned. What happened? There was a brief silence. Then, "The board meeting has already started." His expression froze. What board meeting? The emergency shareholders meeting. His footsteps stopped completely. "What are you talking about?" "I never approved any meeting." His assistant lowered his voice. "It was called this morning, under the chairwoman's authority." For several seconds, the CEO said nothing. Then he immediately ran toward the parking lot. Inside the hospital, his father remained unconscious. The doctor had just informed him that further tests were being conducted. He wanted to stay. He wanted to wait. But the company his father had spent decades building, could not be ignored. As the black sedan sped toward headquarters, his mind became increasingly unsettled. Why hadn't anyone informed him sooner? Why would his mother organize such an important meeting without him? None of it made sense. 30 minutes later, the car stopped outside the company's headquarters. The building looked exactly the same. Employees continued entering and leaving. Security guards greeted him respectfully. Yet, the atmosphere felt completely different. As soon as he stepped inside, conversations suddenly stopped. Several employees quietly lowered their heads. Others exchanged nervous glances. Something had changed. He walked directly toward the executive conference room. Before he reached the door, he heard applause from inside. The meeting was already ending. Without hesitation, he pushed the door open. Every pair of eyes immediately turned toward him. Silence filled the room. At the head of the long conference table sat his mother, calm, elegant, completely composed. She slowly looked at her son. A faint smile appeared. "You're finally here." The CEO looked around the room. Every shareholder was present. Every executive, every senior director, except him. "What is this?" he asked quietly. His mother folded her hands together. "A board meeting." "I can see that." His voice remained calm. "But why wasn't I informed?" One elderly shareholder slowly stood. "Mr. CEO." The notice was sent according to company regulations. The CEO turned toward his assistant. His assistant lowered his head. I wasn't allowed to contact you until the meeting began." The CEO immediately understood. Someone had deliberately isolated him. His eyes slowly returned to his mother. "You planned this." She smiled gently. "I simply protected the company." The company cannot stop functioning because its CEO spends every day at the hospital. Several shareholders quietly nodded. One director spoke. "The company has lost several important opportunities recently. Many investors have become concerned." Another added, "We need stable leadership." The CEO listened silently. He knew the recent delays were real. He had spent almost every waking hour moving between the hospital and the office. His father, Tieu Lac, his daughter, the company. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't be everywhere at once. His mother slowly stood, then walked toward him. "My son," she said softly, "you've always been capable. But lately, you've allowed your emotions to control your decisions." The room became completely silent. She continued, "You abandoned important negotiations. You postponed shareholder meetings. You ignored the board. All because of one woman." The CEO's eyes narrowed. "This has nothing to do with Tieu Lac." His mother's smile disappeared. "No? If she had never entered your life, would your father be lying in a hospital bed?" The words struck like lightning. Several shareholders exchanged uneasy glances. The CEO's fists slowly tightened. "My father's illness is not her fault." His mother looked directly into his eyes. "Whether you believe that or not, the shareholders no longer believe you can separate your personal life from your responsibilities." She picked up a folder, then calmly placed it before him. Inside was a newly approved resolution, temporary transfer of executive authority. Several key decisions would now require board approval, including his own. The CEO slowly looked through every page. Each signature, each approval, everything had already been completed. Without him. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it felt like to lose control. His father had once told him, "Power is never taken in a single day. It disappears little by little, until one morning you realize it no longer belongs to you." Standing in that conference room, the CEO finally understood those words. The meeting officially ended. Shareholders quietly left one after another. No one dared speak to him. Within minutes, only he and his mother remained. The massive conference room suddenly felt cold. She slowly walked toward the large window overlooking the city. Without turning around, she finally spoke. This could have been avoided. The CEO remained silent. She continued, "I warned you from the very beginning. That girl would destroy everything." He answered quietly, "Tieu Lac has never asked me for money, never asked for status, never interfered with the company." His mother slowly turned back. "No, but because of her, you've become weak." She walked closer, stopping only a few steps away. Then, for the first time, she gave him no room for misunderstanding. "You have one final choice." The CEO looked directly at her. "What choice?" Her voice remained perfectly calm. "End your relationship with Tieu Lac. Leave her. Raise your daughter however you wish. But that woman must disappear from your life. If you do that, you will immediately regain full authority. The board will support you. The company will remain yours." She paused, then quietly added the final sentence. "But if you refuse, you'll lose everything. The company, the inheritance, the position your father prepared for you. And when all of it is gone, you won't even have the power to protect Tieu Lac." The CEO stood frozen. One side was the company his father had built with a lifetime of sacrifice. The other was the woman who had stood beside him through every storm, and the little daughter waiting for him at home. For the second time in his life, he was being forced to choose between his family and the people he loved most. But this time, the person forcing him to make that impossible choice was not an enemy. It was his own mother. The conference room had already emptied. Only two people remained, a mother and her son. Between them stood years of trust, respect, and family. Yet at that moment, they felt like complete strangers. The CEO looked at the document in his hands one last time, then slowly placed it back on the table. His voice was calm, much calmer than his mother had expected. I won't sign it. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she smiled faintly. I knew you'd say that. The CEO stared directly into her eyes. You've already made your decision. You didn't call me here to discuss. You called me here to accept. She nodded without hesitation. Exactly. Because emotions have made you blind. I have no choice but to protect this family. The CEO gave a bitter smile. For the first time in my life, I don't know which family you're talking about. Those words caused the older woman's expression to stiffen for just a brief moment. She quickly regained her composure. You'll understand one day, when you've lost everything. Without another word, she picked up her handbag and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she paused. You have 48 hours. Think carefully. If you choose the company, everything returns to normal. If you choose Tieu Lac, you'll walk away with nothing. The door quietly closed behind her. The CEO remained standing alone inside the massive conference room. He slowly turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below him, the city continued moving as always. Thousands of employees hurried through the streets. Cars filled every intersection. Life never stopped. Yet his own world had completely fallen apart. That evening, he didn't go back to the hospital. He didn't return to the office either. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city. Every traffic light reminded him of another memory. The first time he met Tieu Lac, the tiny apartment where they began their life together, their daughter's first smile, his father's proud face when he became CEO, his mother's endless expectations, everything collided inside his mind, across town. Tieu Lac was feeding their daughter dinner. The little girl happily made a mess with her spoon. Rice covered the table, soup dripped onto the floor. Tieu Lac laughed softly. You look just like your daddy. At that exact moment, the apartment door opened. The CEO quietly stepped inside. His face looked exhausted, more exhausted than she had ever seen before. Their daughter immediately reached both arms toward him. Daddy! He forced a smile, then gently carried her into his arms, holding her much tighter than usual. Tieu Lac immediately noticed something was wrong. You haven't eaten, have you? She asked gently. He shook his head. I'm not hungry. She didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she quietly reheated dinner. Several minutes later, the three of them sat around the small dining table. No one spoke. Only the sound of their daughter laughing occasionally broke the silence. After putting the little girl to bed, Tieu Lac finally walked onto the balcony. The CEO was already standing there, looking toward the city lights. She stood beside him, not asking anything, simply waiting. Several long minutes passed. Finally, he spoke. My mother held a shareholders' meeting today. Tieu Lac slowly turned toward him. I wasn't invited. They had already decided everything before I arrived. She remained silent, allowing him to continue. The board has taken away part of my authority. And my mother. He stopped speaking, as if saying the next sentence out loud would make it real. She told me to leave you. The night suddenly became incredibly quiet. Tieu Lac lowered her eyes. She didn't look surprised, only saddened. So, she asked softly, what did you tell her? The CEO looked directly at her, without hesitation. I refused. Tears instantly gathered in Tieu Lac's eyes. But, he continued, I don't know how long I can keep protecting all of you. The company is falling apart. My father is still unconscious. My mother controls the board. And I still don't know who I can trust. Tieu Lac gently reached for his hand. You don't have to protect everything alone. He looked at her in silence. She smiled softly. When I married you, I didn't marry a CEO. I married the man who never gave up. If one day we lose the company, we'll start over. If we lose the mansion, we'll live in a small apartment again. If we lose money, we'll earn it together. She squeezed his hand gently. But if you lose yourself, then we've truly lost everything. For the first time in many days, the CEO felt his heavy heart become just a little lighter. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, the chief physician quietly entered his office. The laboratory report still lay on his desk. Unauthorized sedatives, forged electronic approval, abnormal blood results. The evidence was growing stronger, but he still lacked one final piece: proof of who had ordered it. As he reviewed the hospital surveillance schedule, his eyes suddenly stopped on one name: a nurse who had unexpectedly resigned that very afternoon, without notice, without explanation. The timing was far too perfect. He immediately called hospital security. "I need yesterday's surveillance footage," the guard answered nervously. "Doctor, there may be a problem." "What problem?" "The recordings from the chairman's floor. They've all been deleted." The doctor's face instantly turned pale. Someone had acted before him. Someone knew the investigation had begun. At the same moment, inside a luxury villa across the city, the CEO's mother slowly poured herself a cup of tea. She looked completely relaxed. A man in a black suit stood before her. "The surveillance footage has been taken care of." "And the nurse?" she asked calmly. "She has already left the city." The older woman nodded with satisfaction. "No one will trace this back to us." She looked out the window toward the distant skyline, believing every loose end had been erased. What she never expected was that her own son had made a decision that very night. He would stop trusting appearances. He would stop accepting convenient explanations. And starting tomorrow, he would investigate everything himself. For the first time, the CEO was no longer searching for answers as a son. He was searching for the truth. As the man determined to protect Tieu Lac, his daughter, and the father who had been trying to warn him all along. And once he started pulling on that single thread, the entire web of lies his mother had spent months weaving would begin to unravel. The CEO rushes to the company after learning that an emergency shareholders meeting has been held without him. To his shock, he discovers that everything has been carefully orchestrated by his own mother. The board strips away much of his authority, and she gives him a devastating ultimatum: abandon Tieu Lac and keep the company, or stay with her and lose everything his father built. Although the CEO refuses to betray the woman he loves, the pressure on him grows heavier than ever. Back home, Tieu Lac comforts him and promises to stand by his side no matter what happens. Meanwhile, the hospital's investigation uncovers evidence that someone deliberately kept the chairman unconscious. But crucial surveillance footage has mysteriously disappeared. As the CEO decides to investigate the truth himself, will he expose his mother's conspiracy before he loses both his family and his father's lifelong legacy?